and Curation archivist or librarian at the Digital Library of Georgia, and is in charge of our digital curation and imaging initiatives. So Mary, if you want to take it away.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thanks for coming. I want to say a special thanks to Angela Stanley, Director of Georgia HomePLACE for GPLS, for taking the lead on the first part of this series yesterday. She talked a lot about project management and the things you need to consider when undertaking digitization, and I'm going to be building off of her presentation yesterday to talk about some of those concerns, specifically as they relate to imaging and the conversion process, as well as talking about quality control, post-processing, and digital preservation. So when you're planning a digital project, excuse me, it's important to remember that there are a lot of different directions you can go in depending on the needs of your project. There's no one way to do things, and it's really important always to think about what the goals for your specific project are over the short term, midterm, and long term, and really think about what success looks like for you, your institution, and your stakeholders. So, you know, more isn't always better, but there are places you can make a bigger investment to sort of leverage the success of your project, or to increase the success of your project and make your project more sustainable and usable over time. So one thing to really consider when you're talking about imaging, and in this presentation, I'm mostly going to be talking about still image digitization just because of the time constraints and the sort of scope of the thing, but these really apply to any kind of digital conversion project. You need to think about what the end user experience needs to be from your digital project. So are you digitizing primarily for strictly the informational content of an item? Do you need to preserve the inherent characteristics of that item? Like if it's an archival manuscript, do you need to know the tonality and the paper characteristics? Do you really want the visual history of that item? Or are you interested in the content of, say, a letter or diary? Because that can really change what your parameters for digitization are. I will say from the beginning, and this is, you know, possibly my bias, but this is what I do. So I firmly believe that if you can make a greater investment up front in your imaging and conversion steps to create a rich archival file that then you can use to create subsequent files for online presentation, that investment does pay off long-term, both in increased reusability of the object and also in sustainability over time, because, you know, we've all seen instances of projects done even, you know, 5 years ago where they start to look a little old. They maybe need to be moved forward to keep with changing technology, and having a richer archival file to pull from will give you a greater opportunity to move your project forward. That said, higher quality often has higher costs associated with it. In fact, almost always has higher costs associated with it. And depending on the needs of your organization and the needs of your project and the needs of your users, you may need to think about what your priorities are. If your priority is broader access, and you're more concerned with the speed that you can get these materials out in the world, you know, you may choose to sacrifice some of those reusability goals so that you can do more, you know. And Angela spoke yesterday about the old sort of cliche of, you know, fast, cheap, good, you get two. Well, unfortunately, I've never found a way around that for imaging either. So just bear in mind that it's a balance, and thinking about really what the nature of your project is will help you kind of keep sight of where you need to go. So again, you want to make sure you're aligning your process with your project goals. So this has a lot of bearing in equipment choice and how you set up your workflow. One thing to think about is if you are using, if you feel like a limitation is that you don't have access to sophisticated equipment, then you might be able to go with perhaps reusing something that you already have available, or you know, partnering with someone who can make digitization equipment available to you. I'm going to talk a little more about that later. But if you choose to go in a way that only gets you a lower quality image, it's not going to age as well. It is going to have some limitations associated with it over time. Higher quality images, like I said, they're more reusable. It's going to probably be a more useful representation of the items for your users. But again, this is specific to the project, and you really need to sort of think through that. What do you want that end user experience to be? You also want to think about what potential reuse of the item that your institution needs. Are you going to want to use this for exhibits? Are you going to want to use this in a different context than the one that you are originally presenting it in? And as you move through time and technology changes and rendering technology changes, those higher quality images, they will pay off over the long term. I remember being very excited, you know, when we finally got 256 color monitors. That, you know, the first time I saw a 256 color image, I was like, ooh, look at that. Now, if you threw that up on a Retina display, you wouldn't really be impressed. So again, this is basically the diagram that Angela was talking about yesterday. So I want to here focus on sort of the things that are relevant to the imaging and conversion part of the process. Moving back, in your selection and planning, you really need to be sure that you're thinking about these questions from the beginning, because that's going to sort of determine some of the steps that you take. And it's also you're going to be on a more solid footing as you move into the imaging phase of the process. What you really want to avoid doing is doing a bunch of upfront planning, just sort of punting on those questions about how you're going to actually do the imaging. Then you get your imaging equipment, you get access to your equipment, and you just scan a bunch of stuff. And then, you know, you just sort of try to make sense of it later. That almost always does not end well. Or if it does end well, it's because you do a lot of work to sort of pull it out of the ditch. So you want to make sure that you're building this plan for the later stages, even at the very beginning. When you're assessing the materials that you're selecting your materials, you want to think about, you know, what kind of handling these require, what kind of special equipment might be needed to capture them. Do these materials need conservation work? Digitization, you know, we've all said many times and heard many times, digitization is not preservation. But digitization does offer some good opportunities to leverage this contact with the item. You're going to be working with these items anyway. This is a great opportunity to evaluate the condition that they're in, if there are any things that need to be done to stabilize them and to keep them safe moving forward. One thing that is very, very important, and Angela spoke about this yesterday, and I'm going to probably speak about it a few more times, is to think about your naming convention and how you're going to name and manage your files. If you don't have a good, solid naming convention that will accommodate the kinds of items that you're going to be creating, so that you can keep that linkage between your metadata and your files, then you're going to have a lot of headaches trying to untangle that and link everything back up again after the fact. I could do a whole presentation on naming alone, so I can't get into a lot of detail about this, but one thing you want to remember is that when you're naming files, you're not trying to describe the file in that name. What you're trying to do is create a meaningful, concise way of identifying that file so that then you can use that identifier to link it to the metadata. So an elaborate file name that says, you know, Jane Smith eating birthday cake in, you know, 1985, like, that's descriptive, but it's unwieldy. And so you want to come up with something that is a short, usually a code that represents an event or a time or a collection, and then build it off of that, not try to embed a lot of description in your file name, which I realize is something that we do. I do it too in our sort of day-to-day digital life, but it really breaks down in a digitization context. So that's my pitch for naming conventions. Also, very important that when you create your naming convention, that you document it and you make sure that everyone involved in creating these items, from the imaging to the metadata, that they understand what that name means, so that not only can they create those names if they need to, if they find one that something's not right with, they can identify it and it can be corrected as quickly as possible so that these errors don't linger and cause more problems as you go along. Okay, so once you have your selection and planning and your metadata creation, those sort of planning pieces in place, then you want to sort of start thinking in a concrete way about your imaging workflow and the kind of equipment you're going to use. This is the point where you start your scanning or your conversion work, you apply your naming convention, and you do a first round of quality control. Quality control is not a one-time thing. It needs to happen all throughout the conversion process. And it also sort of has, there are basically two big opportunities that I take advantage of in the workflows that I create for quality control. We do an initial capture phase, and we have a quality control step after that. That's where you're checking for the completeness of the thing that you've scanned. And then there is a post-processing quality control phase, where you're sort of doing your final checks on that one. The post-processing phase, that's when you do your deskewing, your cropping, your final check, and also where you create and finalize what your archival file is going to be, and then subsequently create your derivative files. We'll talk more about that later. Then you get to your ingest and preservation phase. This is the fun part, where you get to put these items online, and also the not exactly fun part, but very important part, where you make sure that they are packaged and stored in a digital environment that is going to keep them safe, that is backed up and is distributed, so that if something happens to one copy of it, you have another copy of it. We'll talk more in depth about that later also. So one thing to think about as you get started in your digitization planning is what you have already. Basically, everything seems to have a camera on it now. And now, while 99% of those cameras are not useful for digitization, it's kind of ignoring the reality to say that none of them could potentially be leveraged for digitization at this point. They're getting more and more sophisticated on phones and on iPads, and there are people who are doing digitization for access, because again, those cameras are not appropriate for creating sort of rich archival surrogate objects that really recreate the object. But you know, you can get the informational content with a lot of those cameras. So people are sort of starting to use those. So while I don't necessarily recommend it, depending on your project needs, it is something to think about. And there are people who have used like an iPad to image small objects using a sort of aftermarket third-party camera stand that you basically plop it on. I've even seen people take an acrylic box and, you know, cut a hole out of it and lay the iPad on top of it and shoot down through that. I'm not recommending that, but just remember that there are a lot of different ways to do these things, and you really have to think about what your needs are as you're designing this project. If you just want a picture to put on your website for advertising purposes and it's going to be 200 pixels by 200 pixels, well, that might be all you need. But again, this is a point, if you're doing a digitization project, you want to invest as much of your resources as you can in creating objects that are going to be reusable and are going to be sustainable in a long-term kind of way. When you're evaluating any equipment you have, maybe you have a high-end DSLR camera already. We use, for some of our digitization projects that we don't want, where we're not as concerned about the inherent characteristics of an object, we do use an 18 megapixel DSLR on a sort of book scanner type setup for some of those things. So it's not exactly correct to say that they have no use. The trick with a DSLR camera is that it requires a lot more control of the environment than a flatbed scanner, which I'm going to talk a lot more about later. So when you're looking at the equipment that you have on hand, you really want to sort of think about how can you position this so that it can capture the material you want? Can you use this in a way that allows you to handle material safely? is anybody gonna like, do you have to stand on a chair on your tippy toes to reach the top of the camera stand to turn the thing? Can you operate it safely? One big problem when using any sort of camera stand or copy stand setup is that lighting becomes very complicated very quickly. That's one huge advantage of a flatbed scanner, is it's a very self-contained unit that controls positioning and lighting all right there, and you don't have to worry about it. Resolution and acuity is basically just, can you get as much fine detail in an image as sharply as you need it to happen? And the other one's file outputs. You want to make sure that your device can output a file that is useful for you. We'll get more into archival file standards later, but typically you want something that is not a highly compressed JPEG. You want an output ideally as a TIFF, but if you can't get a TIFF, if your camera outputs a RAW file, there are ways to work with that, though I will say now and again later that a RAW file output is not a safe file type for archival storage, because a RAW file is, it's still sort of an evolving standard, and there are many different interpretations of it. One other thing that you really want to look at when you're evaluating test images from any equipment that you're considering is to look for digital noise, which tends to be sort of speckles. It just looks sort of like it's almost like a dark sort of cloudiness that you see. Typically you see it in darker areas of an image, and also compression artifacts, which I think we've probably seen as in JPEG files. They end up as sort of like jagged pixelations, and in some other compressed things, they look sort of smeary and like a softness in the image. So those are things, when you're thinking about possibly using something that you already have, you want to kind of put it through all the checks that you would if you were almost like you're considering it for purchase, to consider whether or not it's appropriate for your use. If you are evaluating equipment for purchase, because sometimes if you're considering a digitization project, it might be attached to a grant that has some money for purchasing equipment or something like that. You want to keep in mind that while you may want to buy something to use in-house, remember that that's not the only way that you can do it, and make sure that you don't sort of get locked into this idea that you have to do it in-house. Because as Angela was talking about yesterday, there's a lot of opportunity to work with vendors. There are some statewide organizations that assist cultural heritage institutions in digitizing their materials, like the Digital Library of Georgia. And we certainly partner with people for imaging services. So just remember, you don't have to do it yourself, although there certainly are advantages to doing it yourself sometimes. So when you're looking at equipment, make sure you think about whether or not it's really going to do what you need it to do. Something may do things that are really cool, but if that's not actually going to be relevant to your project, it doesn't matter. Remember the file types. One important thing to think about is, if you're investing this money in this piece of equipment, what's the useful lifespan of this technology likely to be? Is it something that you can upgrade? If it's an elaborate camera stand, is it modular so that you can upgrade the camera, even if you're not going to upgrade the lighting? One very important thing is always try to talk to someone who has one in operation, who is not, has no sort of vested interest in trying to get you to buy one. Like, you can get good feedback from your colleagues who maybe have used it for something similar to what you're thinking about using it for. One very important consideration, and it's a thing that a lot of the sort of glossy PR will kind of confuse the issue on sometimes, is optical resolution versus software generated resolution. Optical resolution refers to the amount of information captured by the hardware itself. So by the camera sensor, by the lenses, without resorting to software interpolation, which sort of artificially boosts the signal that's there already. Software interpolated resolution, it can be useful, but it's not capturing the actual original data that you're trying to capture. So you don't want to rely on that, and you don't want to be, you want to make sure that you're not swayed by somebody making very big resolution claims that are based on software resolution, because it's not actually a reflection of the quality of the hardware. Another important thing is, does it require proprietary software to use? Does that software have to be purchased and upgraded separately? And similarly, one big cost can be a service or maintenance contract on a piece of equipment. Those can get very expensive over time, and sometimes you get into a point of diminishing returns where, even though maybe this piece of equipment is sort of aging out of its useful lifespan, to keep it going at all, you have to keep paying that maintenance fee. And so over time, it can become a less worthwhile, sort of a proportionately larger cost for the utility of the item. So I would say, in summary, that no matter how sophisticated a piece of equipment is, if it doesn't fit your needs, it's going to start collecting dust eventually. So it's important to sort of look at the claims made in literature and in sales pitches, and really think about it in terms of your shop and your project needs. Because if you don't have the personnel to use it, if you don't have the training, if you don't have people who really feel comfortable using this technology, not just in the I'm going to push the button and take the picture kind of way, but if you need to adjust something, if you need to take the tripod apart and put it back together again, like, you need that sort of comfort with it to really make sure that you're getting the use of it over time that you want to invest in. You'll also need some imaging editing software. If you can get Photoshop, Photoshop's great. If you have the computers that are robust enough to run the current version of it, it does a really good job at a lot of things. It's also tremendous overkill for some cultural heritage uses. Really, for cultural heritage digitization, libraries and archives type materials, we're typically not doing any big restoration. We're not doing any major adjustments or sharpening or things like that. The big three are deskew, crop, and resize, and save the files to your chosen formats. So that's a little different. So the 3 to 4 big things that you want are deskew, crop, resize, and get your output that you need. Two that can do this, that are free open source software, are IrfanView, and there's an editor called Glimpse, which is a sort of sub project based on the new image manipulation program. It's kind of like a free open source. It's not really the equivalent to Photoshop. It's not trying to be parallel with Photoshop, but it does cover a lot of the same functionality as Photoshop. Photoshop's pretty pricey, although there are ways now. They changed their purchase model so that it's more a subscription-based kind of thing, which may be better or worse depending on what your institution's sort of purchase requirements are. It can be a bit of a headache. Okay, so all that said, there's all kinds of equipment out there. If you have flat, unbound materials that are smaller than 11 by 17 inches, a flatbed scanner is, I think, by far the most straightforward, easiest to use, most reliable piece of imaging equipment you can have. Now, it has limitations. It's not going to do 3D objects. It's not going to, it's not appropriate for scanning bound archival materials because of the way you have to manipulate the book to position it on the scanner. It's very hard on a binding. You can get away with that for some small, like, pamphlet bindings, and you can get away with that for, contemporary bindings that you're not really that concerned about. But be very, very careful if you choose to scan a historic book on a flatbed scanner, because it is a lot of wear and tear. That said, if it fits your project needs, a flatbed scanner you can go far with. Before we switched to a raw workflow based on a high resolution camera, DLG used flatbed scanners extensively for digitizing lots and lots of objects. So that said, these are a sort of very quick overview of our scanning guidelines that were developed for flatbed scanners. So remember that it's not going to be exactly the same for any kind of equipment you might use, but broadly speaking, these are sort of the guidelines that we use for imaging. So when you're digitizing cultural heritage objects, it's not a restoration. You really want to recreate that experience of using an item in person to the greatest extent that you can. You do have to handle items a lot to do this. So one of your primary concerns is materials handling and how you can handle those items safely. This is a much more tricky process if you're dealing with oversized, brittle, or bound items. Certainly if you're dealing with anything that is oversized, brittle, and bound, that's where you sort of get outside of the realm of what you want to do on a flatbed scanner. The caveat there being that if a bound volume can be safely unbound, like it's on a post binding you can take apart, or it's on a binder, then, you know, if it fits on the scanner, then you can probably actually do that on a flatbed scanner. But the weight and sort of clunkiness, to use a fancy term, make it much more difficult with those kinds of items. And you always want to work from an informed consent kind of model. If you're handling an object, there's inherent risk, and you want to make sure that anybody who is associated with that object is informed of what you're doing, and that you have discussed these risks with them. Those can be internal or external stakeholders. So the nuts and bolts, our recommended flatbed scanner settings. 400 ppi is a good benchmark for creating an archival file that you can later use to create derivative files that can be presented online, or, you know, converted into other formats, used for a lot of different purposes. Typically we scan in 24-bit RGB color. Descreening is a feature that is used on halftone images to prevent moire patterns. It reduces, but unfortunately does not completely magically eliminate them. But make sure you understand what that setting is and when you might want to use it. We turn our auto exposure off, because auto exposure automatically sets a white point that for cultural heritage materials, which are often maybe a little bit yellowed, or the tonality, it's not on a pure white background, it makes the scanner sort of try to force it to a pure white background, and you can end up with some inappropriate exposures. Again, our archival file is an uncompressed single page TIFF. You want to make sure if there's any embedded thumbnail option. Typically there's not on a scanner, but you run into that with cameras. Make sure you turn that off. It will cause a lot of headaches. Transmissive items, a lot of graphics scanners like we used at DLG, and these are the very, very similar to the ones that are in the GPLS DigiKits, which are a great resource if you're a public library or are partnering with a public library. They're included in that. These scanners often have a transmissive item lighting unit that is part of the lid, and that allows you to scan film and slides. When you're scanning film or slides, remember that you have to increase that resolution. And this is where, again, the actual hardware resolution is very important, because what you want are actual samples created from that hardware, not software interpolation. So you have to scan at a much higher resolution. Typically we do 2400 ppi for 35mm slides. Color, if you're scanning color slides, obviously you want to capture that in color. Grayscale, if you're scanning a black and white slide, this is a situation where we would recommend grayscale, because the correction from the raw color inherent in the negative can make that difficult. You can end up with a weird sort of scan. Auto exposure is useful in these situations. Just be aware that some film and things like that, they may have some issues that require you to do a little more manual work. And again, always we recommend the single page uncompressed TIFF for your archival file. Quality control, again, very important as you scan. You want to make sure that the object, that the image looks like the object. Okay, so post-capture editing. I'm rushing through things here because there's a lot to cover in this. So just remember that we're going to put out the link with the slides, and you'll have access to this all later if you want to go back and review. Straightening and cropping. Again, you just want to true up the slide, make sure it's cropped down, leave a little bit of a border around, because you're trying to recreate that experience of using the actual image in person, or using the actual object in person. And then derivative files for presentation. So this is, you've created these rich master files, these rich archival files, and you don't want to, you can't put that giant file on your website. So here's where you're going to scale it down and save it as a JPEG file, or if it's a multi-page item, you might create a PDF file. If it's a file you need to print, you're going to need a derivative that you can print, which would be of higher resolution, so around 300 ppi. You can do this in a batch. You can do it individually as you go through. You have a lot of options for the nuts and bolts of how you do that. But just remember, it's a two-step process. That first capture, your initial capture, is to create a file that contains as much information as you can capture at that point. And then after that, you're going to create a secondary file that's going to be for presentation. So that way you can preserve those archival files long-term. You can present the derivative files to your users in a way that that is more appropriate for screen resolution. You have to deliver your files to your users. If you already have your own CMS, if you have an Omeka site or an Islandora site, this is the point where you're ready to put those in there and link it up with your metadata, put out your PR, show the world the awesome work that you've done. DLG does offer services to Galileo and non-Galileo partners. If you want to do some digitization, but you have questions about ways that you can get your things available to the public, take a look at our site and make sure you check out our partner services, and be sure, if you have any questions, to get in touch with us. We'd be glad to hear from you. Okay, this is going to be a very quick overview of a very large topic. Digital preservation is how you're going to keep your files viable for the long term, because you've put all this work into them. You don't want in 5 years for your collection to look kind of shabby and be essentially of little value to your users despite all that work that you did. These guidelines draw heavily from the National Digital Stewardship Alliance's levels of preservation and the Library of Congress's guidance on preservation and appropriate file formats. Make sure you're including your preservation planning up front. This is something that needs to be baked into your whole digitization plan. It has implications for your scanning, the kinds of files you create, which version of a file do you save? Do you save the version of the file that is before you crop it, after you crop it? Typically we save archival files when they have been rotated and cropped, if you have to rotate them. We do not save, if we have a stitched version where we have to join 2 files together, we save both of those. We save the sort of initial unstitched scans, and then we save the one that is put together, just because there's a lot of extra work in that. So again, there's not a one right answer. You just need to sort of think about what you're going to want to have in the future. Storage is a big consideration with digital preservation. You need to have at least 2 copies. 3 is great, 3 is even better. And you need to have them on different types of storage. Ideally, if you're storing locally, you don't want to have everything on like the same brand of hard drive you bought at the same time. If you're storing on cloud storage, you need to make sure you understand your cloud storage provider's policies on backups, on downtime, on how you get all of your files back at one time if you need to do that. When you're charged for access, or you're using a service where you have to pay, to download things. It's upload free, but you pay for download. Make sure that you know sort of what that looks like, so that you don't get hit with any sort of hidden charges you're not expecting. And also, make sure that their policies reflect the same standards that you would have if you were doing it in-house. So, understand how many, is this on different sort of server pods? Are they geographically distributed? And also what your access policies are for these kinds of things. Who has access to files is a very important part of security. And so you want to make sure that you have as few people with access to your archival files as is necessary to do your work. Also, metadata is a very important part of this. If you don't know what you have, you don't have it. So you need to make sure that you are preserving the appropriate metadata to understand that file and to present that file, and also to maintain those linkages with your descriptive metadata that you've also made a very large investment in. again, make sure you understand your file names because that is essential to that linkage with your descriptive metadata. A word about archival file formats. You want to make sure that you are not using a sort of esoteric, little adopted format for your archival files. That's why we still go with TIFF, even though JPEG 2000 has emerged as one that is getting more and more adoption. We still, at this point, feel like TIFF is a safer long-term bet because there is some variation in the JPEG 2000 standard and how it is interpreted by different software applications. We are using the JPEG 2000s for presentation files, but at this point we are not using them. We're not putting our bets on them for a long-term archival solution. RAW files have a similar problem in that RAW is it's an open standard, but there are proprietary individual interpretations of it that different camera manufacturers use, and they don't play together well. And they don't have, there's not like one RAW editor. There are lots of RAW editors. So if you are creating RAW files, a RAW workflow can be a very good tool for digitization. That's what we have moved to using. But that RAW file, even though it is a very rich format, is not stable enough to be your long-term archival file format. So we still sort of dumb those down to TIFF because we feel like it's a better bet over the long term. You can find out all about these things and many, many, many more kinds of formats from the Library of Congress recommended format guidance and the LOC Sustainability of Digital Formats site. If you have any questions, there's a lot of documentation out there, and both of these resources, they're technically specific, but they are not very, they're not like unintelligibly jargon filled. So I would recommend taking a look at those. File fixity and data integrity, really quickly. Bags are a great technology that has been developed. It's basically a directory structure that you put your files in, you use a tool, and it will create a manifest, a list of those files, and it will create checksums, which are basically a digital fingerprint of those files. Then you can later compare those to make sure that nothing is missing and that none of those files have been changed, either intentionally, mistakenly, or as a result of some sort of corruption from hardware or network problems. It's very, very useful. It does not require a large investment of time or expertise, and it's a very achievable way to really move your digital preservation forward, and I highly recommend using them for anything that you want to keep long term. There's a lot more information available out there. There's a whole presentation about bags on the DLG website. Bag your files if you want to keep them. So again, you want to make sure that you have distributed storage on robust systems. No optical media. Optical media is obsolete at this point, so just don't do it. And also DLG does have archival storage services available. If you are a Galileo or non-Galileo partner, you can read more about that on our website. And it also is a possible part of a sub-grant proposal. They can include that as well. So more information. Elizabeth Lowe has a great presentation on getting started with digital preservation, and also more information at Library of Congress. And that's about it. The rest are references, which again has a lot of information about bags, but that's pretty much what I've got for you. Thank you very much. Sorry I had to hurry through a few things. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to be in touch. I would love to hear from y'all.
So Mary, we have a question. I'm going to be assisting with digitization of artist slides in an art museum's archive. I'm a student. Do you have any recommended readings or foundational literature that could help someone super new to this process with getting more comfortable with it? I love these slides and can't help but wonder where some of the info comes from.
Well, one thing that's always good to check on are the Federal Agency Digitization Guidelines, the FADGI guidelines. That's sort of what we use to inform all of our digitization practices. And I would say I'm not exactly sure what you mean, where the information comes from, if that's a metadata question or not. But yeah, the FADGI guidelines are a great place to start. There also are Yeah, I believe if you look at the LOC, guidelines for digitization, there's also information about in their recommended format station digital capture of different media. So I would say those two places are always a good place to start.
Okay. Another place that, this is Sheila, another place that's really good to check out is the Northeast Document Conservation Center's leaflets.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Those are really great quick overviews. So that's another good one. All right. I have another question. Hold on one moment. All right. Tim asks, or comments and asks, cameras are moving beyond the DSLR to mirrorless. What's your opinion?
Oh, I think mirrorless cameras are really cool. I would not be surprised at all to see people starting to use those more extensively for digitization. They have a lot of advantages. I have a little one that I use for personal use that I really like and have been impressed with. The quality and the size, the sensor size relative to the complexity is really, I think, is really impressive. So I would say, you know, definitely keep your eye on them. If you're thinking about using a raw workflow or a tethered shooting workflow, that as the sensor size gets bigger on those, and I'm not sure what they're up to now. The one that I have is a 20 megapixel, but it's years old at this point. That they could certainly be a viable option. The same considerations would apply with thinking about your, you know, your post-processing environment. Are you going to work in RAW? And you know how you're going to edit your files. But yeah, I think that if you're looking for a tethered shooting workflow, there's no reason, and you're considering that consumer grade of DSLR. Now, when you get into the sort of archival reprographic cameras, that's kind of a whole different ball game, and those are very expensive and pretty complex pieces of equipment. But if you're starting out, you know, kind of at what would be the DSLR level of capture, then I think a mirrorless is certainly worth considering. They're pretty neat.
So there's a question about recording access. The recording and the slides will both be made available hopefully shortly after this presentation is done. You should receive an email about that. So I have another question from Sam. There are a lot of projects right now that are only collecting digital submissions due to COVID-19. What would be the best way to enhance or preserve low quality submissions?
That's a good question. And I suspect there are a lot of people trying a lot of different things right now. I would say one thing to remember from a preservation standpoint is when you're collecting born digital materials, you always want to keep that first, you know, the original file, because that's really your archival file, even if it's maybe low resolution. I don't have a lot of personal experience with this because it's not sort of my area that I work in. I know there are more and more software programs that are out there to enhance images and sort of do algorithmic based sort of sharpening and correction. The big caveat there is, what are you trying to do is the thing that you want to remember, because at least for cultural heritage digitization, the philosophy that we work from is you're presenting the original item, or as good a facsimile as you can get of the original item. If that original item has inherent limitations, I think there's a little bit of a question there as to how much you want to try to artificially improve that. And that is dependent on your project and on your sort of philosophical perspective and what you're trying to achieve. But I wouldn't necessarily assume that you have to make it better. It may just be a matter of presenting what you have in the most user-friendly way possible. Does that make sense? Did I lose audio? Can y'all hear me? Hello?
You're good.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I was flipping between two different, between the chat and the question and answer
Oh,
area.
gotcha. It just sounded very lonely for a moment. I panicked.
No, you're great. At the moment, we don't have any other questions. I did want to add that one of the services that the Digital Library of Georgia offers are training and consultation services. So if you do have questions about the digitization process as a whole, or in particular about imaging or digital curation, please feel free to reach out to us. If you are in a public library, you have access to an excellent contact person, and that's Angela Stanley, who's the director of HomePLACE, and she can also help you. You know, feel free to reach out. I have a question from Muriel. Is there a particular website or blog that talks about various projects? If you could give us a little more context for that question, Muriel, I think that might be helpful. Are you talking about standards, or are you talking about successful projects that people have done? Okay, and she would like to get some ideas of successful projects.
I don't know of any one off the top of my head that's sort of focused on that. It seems like that stuff is very distributed among a lot of channels. Sheila, do you have any thoughts on that?
So I think if you're, it sort of depends on what you're looking for. If it's how people have successfully done metadata work, that's going to be a different place than somebody talking about imaging and that kind of thing. I would, this is a resource that that Angela mentioned yesterday. The Digital Library Federation often has some really helpful tools that are available. So that would be one place that might be helpful. If you're more interested in types of collections or materials that have been digitized, certainly you can, if they're Georgia related, please take a look at the Digital Library of Georgia's site. There is a sort of national aggregation of digital collections and projects called the Digital Public Library of America. And that's another place where you could go, and that's dp.la. Any other questions? If we don't have any other questions, I'd like to thank Mary and Angela both for their excellent presentations today and yesterday, and to thank all of you for joining us. We look forward to hearing from you, and please feel free to reach out should you have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.